Sadly, the church is in decline today.
If truth does not exist, we will not be able to live and function as civilized individuals in a society.
Students in the public education system at large of our nation are left with the impression God's irrelevant because he's never mentioned.
We sort of have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country that the world has ever seen, with more individual freedom and opportunity to choose what you want to do with your life and where you want to go to church. We have that, and we forgot how we got here.
So we're going to answer the question, why all the fuss?
Despite ever-increasing efforts to undermine the authority and accuracy of God's Word, the Bible stands firm.
Science and the Bible are inextricably linked.
We see evidence of incredible design.
God has made it incredibly clear.
Men, listen to me today. God has a calling on your life. Kids need you. Women need you. Our country needs fathers and responsible husbands today.
55 out of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians.
We have the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world.
The Western world was successful because it was built upon biblical values.
All right, does the mic sound good? Okay. I notice there's a lot of younger people here today, and so I'm just going to briefly give a quick testimony, very quick, because I got a lot of slides to go through. But I was raised in the Pacific Northwest, actually, in the Vancouver, Portland area, and very unchurched area. And I grew up just a wild pagan for all practical purposes. And my father was a research chemist, and he was an evolutionist, and so I grew up with Carl Sagan's book on our coffee table, that kind of thing. And so anyways, in high school, I was just doing, the basic wild stuff all my classmates were doing. And after that, of course, getting in trouble all the time for it. And then after that, I went to a community college for a couple of years doing the same nonsense. But after about 2 years of community college, I'm driving down the road in my 68 Mustang Fastback, which I wish I still had. And I'm just crying out. I mean, I'm at the bottom of the barrel, and I say, God, if you are out there, please do something. I have absolutely had enough. I mean, I was literally just at that point. And 2 months later, I had a Christian roommate at college, and he shared the gospel with me. And I got born again, got saved, prayed, asked Jesus Christ into my heart. And but shortly after that, I'm getting blasted with evolution. And I was going to Washington State University. That's where I transferred to finish off my bachelor's degree, Pullman, Washington. Actually, probably not too far from here, right? So anyways, so I'm there at Washington State University. And I just got saved, getting blasted with evolution from my professors, and the worst of it was from all the students. All the other students, were blasting me with this evolutionary nonsense. And so I go to the Christian bookstore and I say, hey, what do you got? I need something to help me with this origins issue. And so they gave me this book, and I'll go ahead and name names. Anyways, it was The Fingerprint of God by Hugh Ross. And so I'm reading this book, and if you know anything about his message, he tries to integrate deep evolutionary time, with the Bible, which to me, when I first read that book, I said, this does not work. And I had no preconceptions, no presuppositions. I was not raised in a Christian home whatsoever. But I knew what worked and what didn't. And I had enough common sense for that. So I go back to the Christian bookstore and say, hey, what else do you got? And so they gave me Scientific Creationism by Henry Morris II. So how many of you read that book? I mean, that was a life changer. And so I read that book, and I'm like, wow, this totally works. This totally fits with the scripture. Science does support the Bible. And so I bought everything ICR had at that point. That was before the days of the internet, back in the early 80s, you know, where you send a check in and hope you get something back in the mail, right? So anyway, so I literally read everything I could that was written by Henry Morris and Duane Gish, and of course Duane Gish had a huge impact on my life as well. So anyways, little did I know, here I would be 40 plus years later working for that very ministry, which really, you know, was instrumental in building my faith as a young Christian. So anyway, so let's get going. And so my talk this morning, I don't know if I've ever done a talk at 8:30 in the morning. I'm so glad people are praying for me. My wife, all these other people. So anyways, let's see where this goes. Anyway, so this is on the diversity of life, biblical kinds, and adaptation. And so a lot of this talk is actually fairly new. So let's get going here. So Charles Darwin was the one that came up with this whole idea of the tree of life, so to speak. And when I was in academia, oh, by the way, I ended up getting a PhD at Clemson University, and then ended up also being a faculty member in the Department of Genetics and Biochemistry at Clemson for about 10 years after I got my PhD. And so anyways, I was actually involved in the National Science Foundation Tree of Life project, if you can believe that. And so I had all these evolutionary colleagues. Of course, I was a creationist, but you know, you kind of have to lay low when you're in that kind of environment. So anyways, I was actually involved in the National Science Foundation Tree of Life project, which I think is actually still going on. So I had lots of grant money there, working with all these other evolutionists around the country. My main contribution was the genomics, the DNA sequencing, and the gene analysis and gene expression and all that. So I really wasn't involved in the evolutionary part per se, but I was like a technology guy. So anyways, Charles Darwin came up with this whole tree of life idea. And so there's kind of a simplified version of it. In other words, we all supposedly evolved from a single-celled organism which then branched off into the various categories of life, you know, plants and animals and so forth. And one of the things that Duane Gish really brought out in his stuff was that, hey, there's no transitional forms, especially between all these major phylogenetic or taxonomic groups. But you know, we can get even more specific than that. Basically, the Bible says that everything was created after their kind, and then humans in the image of God. And so basically we say created kinds. We see a lot of variation within kinds, but we see the Bible doesn't say humankind, but you could say that, the human kind, the dog kind, and so forth, lots of variation. I think there's multiple frog kinds, and then roses and so on. And so as creationists, we would not buy into this evolutionary tree nonsense, because there's no transitional forms essentially linking all the different kinds. But we do see what we call a creation orchard, and some of you have probably heard that before. In other words, we have creatures, and then they diversify within their kind. So there's a lot of diversity within those kinds, and that's what I want to talk about today. And so this whole idea of kinds and where they came about, according to evolutionists, they believe in this gradualistic paradigm where you get mutations in DNA in the genome, and these mutations magically create some wonderful new trait, and then nature selects for this trait. And then when you add in millions of years to the whole paradigm, you get this magical thing called evolution happening. And so that is the evolutionary paradigm. And there's some major problems with that. Well, the first one is we don't see evolution in the past, and I've actually got a talk this weekend on the fossil record where I actually get into the fossil record in detail, but we do not see evolution in the fossil record. It's not there. And we don't see evolution occurring now. We don't see chickens morphing into rabbits and that kind of thing now. We just see creatures essentially staying the same. And even in Darwin's day, they noticed this. And when Darwin was pushing what he was pushing, they're kind of like, well, we're not really seeing this right now, but okay. But from my field that I work in, there is no mechanism for evolution. And we're talking about mutations creating wonderful new traits, because that is just, it doesn't exist. And what's really interesting now is that we have this entire section of the evolutionary academic community now rejecting this neo-Darwinian paradigm. And this is actually from a web page from a conference that was done in 2018. It was sponsored by the New York Academy of Sciences, and the name of the conference was Evolution. But look at what they said on the website advertising this conference. So they said for more than half a century, it has been accepted that new genetic information is mostly derived from random error-based events, meaning mutation. And now, look what I highlighted in red here. Now it is recognized that errors or mutations cannot explain genetic novelty and complexity. Why is that? Because all these different traits that we have in ourselves, in other creatures, in plants and things, they're not controlled by single genes. They're controlled by hundreds to, if not thousands, of different genes working together in gene networks. And so this whole idea of getting a single mutation that would create this wonderful new trait, it doesn't exist anymore. And now you've got this entire community of evolutionists now that are rejecting neo-Darwinism. That formula I gave you a few slides back. They actually have their own website, and it's called The Third Way of Evolution, or The Third Way. And so there you can actually go there, thethirdwayofevolution.com. I think it used to be .org, was a nonprofit, but now it's .com. And you can actually go to that one tab there where it says people, click on that tab, and you will see scientists from all over the entire world, from the United States, from Europe, from Israel, that are totally ascribing to this new paradigm. But let's read what they have to say here on their website, because it's very interesting for us as creationists. And it says, the vast majority of people believe that there are only two alternative ways to explain the origins of biological diversity. One way is creationism. So it's interesting, these are evolutionists, by the way, that reject neo-Darwinism. So they want to get the creationist thing, they want to put that right up front to let you know, hey, we're not creationists. But anyways, they say one way is creationism that depends upon intervention by a divine creator. And now listen to this. That is clearly unscientific. That is clearly unscientific because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force into the evolution process. The commonly accepted alternative is neo-Darwinism. And now listen to what they say about that, which is clearly naturalistic science, exactly, but ignores much contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of heredity variation. In other words, they're saying, yeah, this mutation thing is a big problem. We do not have a mechanism. So John Sanford has done some interesting work, and he basically, with some other people and some computer scientists and programmers, developed some software where they actually modeled evolution. And they said, hey, we will give the evolutionists all their own, we will give them the benefit of the doubt on all the things they want to believe, with the whole Darwinian paradigm, mutation, selection, all that. And they modeled that, and they found out that given the evolutionists' own assumptions, that mutations will build up faster than they can be removed. In other words, things are not getting better, they're devolving. And so the human genome, and his study was largely based on the human genome, is actually devolving, not evolving. In other words, our genomes are not getting better over time. We're accumulating mutations and things are actually getting worse. And so that's why at the time of Moses, the world had been around for several thousand years at that point. You're not allowed to marry close relatives anymore because these mutations could manifest in birth defects and so on. So anyways, I want to move along here pretty quickly. John Sanford and Chris Roop also has worked with him on this. Has shown that, as mapped out actually the lifespans of humans after the flood, and they just plummeted after the flood. And a lot of this is due to this genetic entropy. And I think there was also environmental factors and things playing into this as well. So it wasn't wasn't an overall simple thing as to why human lifespans decreased, because I think the environment radically changed after the flood compared to the pre-flood world as well. But definitely the genetic load or this mutational load was really building up at this point. But you know what's really cool is that is that this mutation thing can also be used, even though it debunks evolutionists as not really providing a real mechanism for evolution to occur. As creationists, we can also use it to prove the age of the earth. And so this is a slight diversion from what I really want to talk about, but I just wanted to throw this in there. And I've got this in another talk too, but I think it's really exciting. So in 2012, there were 2 studies done. One was in North America, the other was in Europe, and they sequenced the protein coding regions of the human genome. And we can now do that, or we can just sequence specific parts of the genome. And they just sequenced the protein coding regions of the human genome, thousands of people in North America, thousands of people in Europe. And they found out that there were many mutations in these protein coding regions, and they called them rare variants, not common variants. Common variants or common variation was built into Adam and Eve at the beginning, but these are real mutations. And instead of calibrating this data with deep evolutionary time, like evolutionists like to do, they actually used empirical data. How fast do populations grow? How many children do people have? Real demographic empirical data. And they found out in both of these studies that rare variation, which actually was over 80% of those rare variants were connected to heart disease, to diabetes, to cancer, really bad stuff. So in other words, these mutations are not doing good things. But they showed that rare variation, or those real mutations, gave a timeline back only 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. And before that, they said, oh, it flatlined. And when I saw these papers and read them, I about fell out of my chair, because here are evolutionists admitting, even though they're still holding to their ridiculous paradigm, that this rare variation only goes back about 5,000 years ago, which is a biblical timeline based on the chronologies and genealogies we have in the Hebrew scriptures. So anyways, I thought that's, mutations are not helping evolution, but they're helping creationists prove creation, right? So it's amazing all the science that fits up with scriptures. It just absolutely is. So let's get into what I want to talk about, created kind diversification. So created kinds, or creatures in general, plants and animals, they have built-in systems of physiological, anatomical, and metabolic adaptation. God has built these things into creatures so that they can adapt and go in and pioneer new environments and new niches within the limits that God has built into them. And of course, my specialty is genetics, and I've actually got a book coming out, hopefully towards the end of this year, where I actually talk about the genetic systems of variation. Genetic variation, or standing genetic variation, epigenetics, and all different kinds of gene and genome modification systems that are built into DNA, that are built into the genome. And so all of these things factor into how created kinds diversify and why we see all this diversity within a lot of the different created kinds. Some of the created kinds, we don't see much diversity in them, but most of them we see quite a bit. And so let's go over this whole paradigm and kind of simplify it a little bit if we can. So at the Institute for Creation Research, we call this continuous environmental tracking, or CET. And it starts off with the fact that all these different creatures, including us as humans, have all kinds of sensors built into our bodies, just like man-made engineered things have sensors, only God's engineering is like, a million times more complicated than what we can do. And the humans are coming up with some pretty amazing stuff, but it's just a shadow of really what God does or has done in creation. But things start off with sensors. So we have to sense what's going on around us. And then those signals from the sensors are sent into signal processing systems that actually have biological algorithms built into them. Those signals are processed, and then those lead to adaptive responses. And so that's just basically a simplified overview of the whole CET paradigm. Well, you think about it. Let's think about an organism. There's all kinds of things that organisms can sense, and this is just a fraction of things that organisms can sense, like temperature. I mean, we could all walk into a room, right? And if it's really cold, then we want to get out. We leave and go somewhere else, right? Or maybe, and so temperature is important. Population size, lots of different creatures will sense. It's called quorum sensing, or they'll sense the populations around them and how many creatures are in that population. And nutrient availability. And this is especially important for things like bacteria and plants and things. And they literally have sensors that detect the nutrient availability in the soil or in the solution they're in. Symbionts, and the symbiotic relationships are absolutely amazing. And we actually have them with our gut bacteria in our guts, bacteria that live in our skin, in our nose, in our ears. And we have sensors that interact with all these microorganisms, as well as many other different kinds of creatures. Plants detect light intensity and quality, not just the intensity of light, but the spectrum that the light is in, that's coming to them. And then pheromones. And so there's all kinds of pheromones that are released in the environment by plants and by insects and things that are detected by other organisms. Oxygen, CO2 content, pH. And so this is just a small smattering of things that organisms detect through all the sensors that are in their body. Well, let's bring this over into the human realm a little bit so we can make some sense out of all this. So what's the big rage now is self-driving cars, right? You can even go out and buy a brand new Tesla, and I've got a friend back in Dallas, and he literally tells it where he wants to go, and he just sits there, and the car drives him there. And we were kind of debating yesterday where this all might really be going, but anyways, it serves as a good illustration for what I want to talk about today. So self-driving cars utilize a whole suite of different kinds of sensors. So they have LiDAR, radar, cameras, ultrasonics, and they literally perceive their entire environment around them in a 360-degree sense or a 3D sense. So they can understand the surroundings and keep you, within your lane and keep your speed within a certain range and all that stuff. And so I think this is a great analogy to use when we talk about creatures. And so these sensors in all these self-driving cars enable obstacle detection, lane tracking, navigation, and they're typically combined what they call via sensor fusion algorithms for safe decision making. And so let's think about biological organisms. Well, this paper was actually published in iScience, and it was done by conventional scientists, evolutionary scientists, but they recognized the engineering that was in the lateral lines of cichlid fish. And so cichlid fish, it's a common fish that lives around Africa in lakes and streams and rivers. And listen to what they say here. This sounds like something an engineer would say that's creating something like a self-driving car. And so the title of the paper is Adaptive Diversification of the Lateral Line System During Cichlid Fish Radiation, meaning adaptation and pioneering environments and things. The mechanosensory lateral line system is used by fishes to sense hydrodynamic stimuli in their environment. It provides information about flow regimes, proximity to substrate, and the presence and identity of prey and predators, and represents a means of receiving communication signals from other fish. Doesn't that sound a lot like the self-driving car that I just put up there? Well, and this is just talking about the lateral lines in fish, not all their other sensory systems. And so here's an example of let's say that's the ancestral cichlid fish there that had all the genetic diversity within it to create all these variants of it. And so anyways, we have fish here. We have argivores, in other words, Algivores, in other words, fish that eat algae, and so their body shape and head structure changes and the lateral line changes so they can eat algae. And then we have other fish that are called piscivores, meaning they eat other fish. And so they have lateral lines and sensors, and their body shapes and adjust to do that. And then we have zooplankton eaters as well. And of course, they change accordingly as well. And molluscivores that eat mollusks or shellfish. And then the benthic fish, benthic just merely means that they feed off the bottom of the lake or the river or the stream, whatever. So this basic cichlid fish, or the ancestral progenitor of all these different variants, had this variability and these systems built into it to create all these different kinds of cichlids that could eat all these different kinds of food and pioneer all these different niches. And so it's really amazing. And so this material is coming out in the conventional literature just all over the place now, and it's just absolutely amazing. I want to talk about one really dramatic example of this, and this has to do with the diversification of stick spiders in the Hawaiian Islands. And this was an absolutely fascinating study. And they said repeated diversification of ecomorphs in Hawaiian stick spiders. So in other words, these Hawaiian stick spiders on all these different islands in the Hawaiian Islands were genetically identical, but yet they displayed a different, what we call a phenotype, or different anatomical and physiological features based on the environment that they pioneered. And the evolutionists believe that this took millions of years, but of course it didn't. And so look at all these different kinds of stick spiders. And so there's at the top, there's 3 different kinds on the island of Kauai, and you can see ones that are brown, ones that are yellow, ones that have kind of a hook shape at the end of their abdomen. Some have fatter abdomens, but yet these are all genetically identical. And then once again, look at Oahu and all the different kinds of stick spiders there in different environments on Oahu, and the other islands on Molokai and the main island of Hawaii as well. So, and these are all genetically identical, and so that's why they call them ecomorphs, because they're all the same species. Well, excuse me. Well, at ICR, we're actually working with real creatures to study CET, and we're working with the Mexican cavefish. So how many of you have heard of the blind cavefish? And so what's the traditional story on the cavefish? Oh, well, there's a mutation, and it knocked out eye development, and somehow the environment magically selected for that, and that's how you got a cavefish. Well, that's really not the case. And so first of all, in this picture, the upper fish is a surface fish, and so the surface fish live in the streams and the lakes down in Mexico. These are found in Mexico. They're called Astyonyx mexicanus. And below that is a cavefish. And so I don't know how these fish originally got into these subterranean caves. Maybe a storm system came through and washed them in there, or maybe they just decided to go in there. I don't know how in the world they got there. But anyway, so these cavefish, they lose their eye development, which is completely shut down through a process called apoptosis, which is a genetic process which shuts down a certain developmental system. And your eyes are part of your brain, and the most intensive organ in your body that uses energy is your brain. And so these fish do not need eyes in caves because there's no light there. And so that eye development is shut down so that it can distribute that energy to other parts of its body that need it. But it's not just that. In fact, there's a whole list of things. And so this is why a mutation in the eye development knocked out the eye. No, there's a lot more going on than eye loss. So yeah, eye loss is one of the main things that we obviously see. But the body shape changes. The shape of the fish's heart changes when it goes into a cave. Its brain radically changes shape. It's wild how the brain completely changes shape into something totally different from a surface fish. The blood hemoglobin content increases because there's a lot less oxygen in caves. The lateral line development, which we just talked about with the cichlid fish, is enhanced. The sensory pits, which are these pits full of mechanosensors in the fish's head, increase as well. Their feeding behavior changes, pigmentation loss, and all kinds of other things. And what's really amazing is these cavefish, they can do all these elaborate mating dances. They can swim all over in the tank. You can put all kinds of obstacles in the tank, and they will avoid every single obstacle. They know where the edges of the tank are. They know where all the other fish are, but they're totally blind. And you can actually walk into the room where the aquariums are that have these cavefish, and you can walk as softly as you possibly can, but those fish will sense your feet on the floor walking into the room. And because they're all a bunch of little mooches, they all come up to the front of the tank wanting food. And they can't see anything. But then we've put all kinds of obstacles and things in the tank. They never hit them at all because they know where everything is because of all these sensory systems that didn't pop up, but that became considerably more enhanced, and most of them are mechanosensor type things that operate within a specific hertz frequency range, and which has actually been measured. So it's absolutely amazing. So anyways, we have lots of fish tanks there. If you've come to the Discovery Center in Dallas, we actually have a window in the Discovery Center where you can kind of look in and see some of this research going on. And we've done a number of things. One of the things we've tried to do is try to make cavefish go back to their surface phenotype, and we have made some progress, but because we've just gotten going on this project, we're just beginning to see some initial results. But anyways, one of the things we did was expose these cavefish to grow lights, really intense, high-intensity grow lights. And there's a cavefish at 0 days, but look at 40 days. Look at all the pigment that is now developing in that fish. And then look at 72 days and all of the pigment that has now developed in that fish. So you can see these things are reversible. And so there is a surface fish there, and below it is a surface fish. So the other experiment I just talked about was with cavefish, and now we're working with surface fish as well. And we exposed surface fish to deionized water. It's very low conductivity. And so one thing about caves is they have a lot less minerals in the water. So the conductivity of the water is much less, and the fish can actually sense the electrical conductivity of the water around them. And so they adapt accordingly through those sensors as well. So there is a surface fish that we grew in low conductivity water, and after 2 weeks, look at the loss of pigment. 2 weeks, the loss of pigment in that fish. And so we're working on this from both angles. But here's a paper that was published at the American Museum of Natural History, Adaptation to Caves in Scorpions May Be Reversible. So there are other labs working on not just cavefish, but other kinds of creatures, and finding out the same thing. That these phenotypes that these creatures are expressing in caves, in low light, low conductivity, all these conditions can be reversible. So it's not based on a mutation and the standard Darwinian paradigm. In fact, we see these all kinds of creatures, for whatever reason, inhabiting caves and developing the same traits. So there's a blind cave crab, a blind cave salamander, all different kinds of fish. That's a catfish-like creature there. And based on and every cave is different. There are no two caves that are exactly the same. So every cave has a different amount of food that's available, different levels of conductivity, different pH, different amounts of CO2 and O2. And so, but it's just amazing the things that God has built into creatures to where they can adapt to these just crazy environments. It really is. Well, let's move on past fish now. Let's talk about lizards. And so every time you see rapidly evolved, that means the creature adapted quickly. It didn't evolve. And, But anyways, evolutionists love to use this term rapid evolution. Lizards rapidly evolve after introduction to island. And then they say in just a few decades, the 5-inch long lizards have developed a completely new gut structure, larger heads, and a harder bite, researchers say. And so this is the creature there. And it is a lizard. It's called the Italian, what is that? I should have put the title of the thing there. Italian wall lizards. So anyways, in 1971, biologists moved 5 adult pairs of Italian wall lizards from their home island of Pod Copiste, which is a very small island, which is like perfect as an outdoor laboratory, in the South Adriatic Sea to the neighboring island of Pod Mercaru. And so they seeded this island, and then of course after a few years, you have a lot more than just, 10 lizards, you have literally thousands of them. And so they went back and analyzed to see what was going on there. So what were the difference between the two different environments? Well, while Pod Copiste had higher prey diversity, in other words, living things to eat, the introduced lizards on Pod Mercaru faced different, more vegetation-heavy conditions and different food sources, resulting in the rapid evolution observed by scientists. After 36 years, the researchers studied them for adaptive changes. And so these are the two different islands there. You can see one is almost completely devoid of vegetation. And so the lizards there are actually eating insects and things like that and not plants. But on the other island, or Pod Mercaru, they're having to eat vegetation, and there were a lot less insects and things there. And this also, not only does this help us to understand adaptation, but I think it also shows you the capacity of creatures that before the fall, could have eaten, like reptiles, eaten plant material, and then after the fall, began eating each other. So anyways, but keeping in line with our topic here. So anyways, this is Duncan Ishik. He was the head professor here. He's a professor of organismic and evolutionary biology at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and these are direct quotes from the researcher that led this project. Striking differences in head size and shape, increased bite strength, and the development of new structures in the lizard's digestive tracts were noted after only 36 years. A process evolutionists claim takes millions of years, but no, they saw it in 36 years, which is an extremely short time scale. And then he also said these physical changes have occurred side by side with dramatic changes in population density and social structure. So here's the name of another article, Rapid Fire Evolution. I kind of like that better than rapid evolution. And this is, and they have done a lot of studies with the anole lizard, which is actually a very common lizard in the southeastern United States and in the Caribbean. So depending on the island or habitat, you have vegetation differences, different kinds of competitors that are competing for food with the lizards, different kinds of climate, and these lizards rapidly adapt to all of these different kinds of things. And the trait variations that are expressed are according to the environment they're living in. Leg length. So a lot of lizards where there's a lot of wind on the island, the leg length changes so they can grab onto stuff and maintain a tighter hold. In addition to the foot pad size, stickiness helps them do that as well. Their body metabolism changes, their thermal regulation changes, as well as the skin color. And these changes can be observed in only one generation with these anole lizards. And there's multiple papers that you can dig up on these things. It's really amazing. Well, let's move on and talk about birds. And what's really interesting is that the COVID pandemic helped us to of all things, helped us to analyze rapid changes in birds. And so, beak shape changes were observed in dark-eyed juncos at the University of California, Los Angeles, where the birds developed different beak shapes to take advantage of human food scraps, and this is before COVID. So students on a college campus, they're leaving food all over the place, or flinging it here, flinging it there, or whatever, and being messy, or there's lots of food in trash cans and things. And so birds will take advantage of these food scraps, and literally their body shape changes, their beak shape changes, all these things change. But then during the COVID-19 lockdowns, there were no longer any students on campus leaving garbage all over the place for the birds to eat. And their bills changed rapidly to what is called a non-urban shape as the human food vanished. But then when the COVID restrictions were lifted, the bird shapes changed back again as the human activity came back, and they once again took on this urban shape to their beaks and things. Well, the behavioral changes, birds' behavioral changes occur as well when birds take advantage of an urban environment. So urban birds tend to be bolder. They're less afraid of humans, and they're more innovative in foraging, and also such as using cars to crack nuts or scavenging. That's just what you want to see, right? Is a bird cracking a nut on the hood of your car. But anyways, and vocal adaptations change. That's one of the most amazing things about birds is their communication abilities with all the vocalizations that they do. So anyway, city birds such as great tits will sing at higher frequencies and louder pitches to be heard over the traffic and all the urban noise. Physical and dietary shifts. Urban birds have shorter wings for faster maneuvering in urban environments and have adapted their digestive systems to handle human food waste. Darker feathers or melanism content changes. So some urban bird populations show increased levels of melanin content or darker plumage in their feathers, which help them manage higher toxin levels and pollution. So it's just amazing all the different systems that kick into play in birds that pioneer urban environments. And so here's an example of just so you can get a visual of what these birds look like. There's a dark-eyed junco there, and there's a great tit, and then Darwin's finches. And I've actually got an article on Darwin's finches and all the different changes that were built into Darwin's finches, which, by the way, most of them are interfertile with each other, so we all know that they're the same species, just different ecotypes or ecomorphs. Well, let's move on to something that we all care about, and that is, actually some of this is going to be in another talk that I've got on human origins, but let's get into this and how it plays out in regards to, how am I doing on time here? 7 minutes. Okay, well, we'll go a little quickly here then. So anyways, all people share one original ancestral origin, and the scriptures say that God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. What does that mean, one blood? Well, you think about it. Pedigreed animals, whether you're breeding dogs or cats or horses, whatever, are said to have bloodlines, right? Genetically related relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, are called blood relatives. All humans being of one blood is pretty simple. It just means one line of genetic descent, originally from Adam and Eve. And let's look at some of the major points in the human population on the face of the earth. So creation was 6,000 years ago, according to the Hebrew scriptures. The global flood was approximately 4,300 years ago, and which was a genetic bottleneck, by the way. And then the earth was, I should go back there, the earth was repopulated by Noah's 3 sons and their wives. The Tower of Babel was a key event in the scriptures, and that's where we get the Table of Nations, or essentially approximately 7 main people groups. And here we are now, 2025, that's a little old, but 2026, roughly a little over 8 billion people. And so the Bible has a lot to say about human diversity. And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And again, here in Genesis chapter 10, 32. These are the families, or what I like to call people groups, and I'll get into that more in my human diversity talk. Of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So the Bible has a lot to say, actually, about human diversity and how it came about, which we'll get into more later. Well, Nathaniel Jensen at Answers in Genesis, who actually used to work with us in Dallas at ICR, actually looked at human mitochondrial DNA, which you inherit from your mother, and he found 3 main branches in the human mitochondrial DNA tree, which would correspond with Noah's 3 sons' wives. Isn't that amazing? Once again, science supports the scripture, but this has to do with human diversity. And the Bible says, now the whole earth had one language and one speech, therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. And we'll talk about why that's important later in the conference in all the different people groups. But we know we need to bring in some post-flood conditions, because as most of you probably know, if you don't, this is immediately after the flood. The conditions of the flood created the necessary conditions for a global ice age, which was predominantly over the northern region of the earth. And you think about it. So the ark lands there in the Middle East, and what's the main direction that people can go? Well, into Africa and then into Asia. And this is a map of modern, current human genetic diversity, with the green areas having the most human genetic diversity within them. And I don't think it's any coincidence that that's where people first went immediately after the flood, and as then they filled the rest of the earth, then there's less diversity in those more distant places. So human genetic diversity is explained by the Tower of Babel. So what about all the traits that make people different? Well, this once again goes back to this one gene, one trait nonsense. When I was in high school, in a biology class, the teacher said, okay, feel your ears to see if you have an attached earlobe or a dangling earlobe. And I know a lot of you want to grab your ears right now. But anyways, we were told, oh, the attached earlobe, it's a recessive trait. It's a single gene. Well, it turns out that's not the case at all. This is the American Journal of Human Genetics, a publication there in 2017. So moreover, meta-analysis, or genomic, in other words, genome-wide association studies, genomics, moreover, meta-analysis of literally thousands of human genomes across all 4 cohorts or sampling populations revealed a total of 49 significant loci. In other words, at least 49 different places all across the genome were contributing to this earlobe trait, not just a single gene. What about this thing here called the epicanthic fold, or what leads to what's called the Asian eye? Well, obviously we see this all over Asia, but did you know that this is also showing up in a population of people in South Africa called the San peoples? Well, here's a group of people in northern Norway, Finland, and Russia called the Swedish Sami, and there's a famous skier there, who also have Asian eyes, blonde-haired, and blue eyes. So anyways, so what about the one thing that makes humans different? Variation in human pigmentation or skin color. Well, by the way, that study was done in Africa. Which continent has the most genetic diversity in that previous slide? Africa. So if you're going to study any human trait, where are you going to go? Africa. Because you have people in Africa that are very light-skinned all the way to very dark-skinned, but it's all based on the melanin content in the skin. And this particular study, they analyzed over 1,500 different people, sequenced their genomes, and looked at the melanin content biochemically in their skin. And they found 6 major genes together accounted for about 30% of the observed skin color variation. So 6 genes only accounted for 30% of the variation. In other words, hundreds of genes are involved in creating skin color variation. And so this is a Nigerian couple living in Great Britain, and in 2010, they had a baby that had blonde hair, blue eyes, a very light colored skin, and they actually did all kinds of genetic testing to make sure there was nothing weird going on here. And yes, this truly was their child, but look at the hidden variation or adaptive variation that was built into their genomes that they didn't even know they had. But this is something I think is more likely to happen, say, at the Tower of Babel, where you have people like this. So this lady here is a white type European lady, and this guy has some African ancestry in his blood, and he's Jamaican. And look at the variability in their children. And these two guys are actually fraternal twins, not identical twins, but fraternal twins. And look at the difference between them and the various genes that are being expressed that were passed on. So what's the evolutionary story for skin color? Think mutation, selection, millions of years of evolution. Well, according to evolutionists, they say, lighter-skinned people with less melanin would be selected against in the tropics, but favored at higher latitudes. Don't you love the way they think of us like a bunch of animals? just no different than an elephant or whatever. Well, then this news article comes out. Inuits live in very cold climates. Why do they have dark skin? Well, they live in cold climates because they want to live there. Not because nature is doing anything as far as selecting against or for them. But this whole paradigm, they think that skin cancer is the selective agent, the mystical selective agent here. Well, the problem is this is the worldwide incidence of melanoma, and look at the reproductive ages of humans where they would be having children is 15 to 39, hardly any skin cancer whatsoever. So there's no so-called selection going on there at all. When does skin cancer really start showing up? When you're way past your childbearing years. So this whole idea of nature or the intensity of sunlight selecting against humans and causing evolution is just absolute nonsense. There's nothing to support it at all. But anyways, I actually have a talk on human evolution, but I'm just going to touch on a couple things here. So if you've seen this progression of human evolution, you know that and you've heard other creationists speak, it's absolute nonsense. Is all we really have in the fossil record is fossil apes and fossil humans with a lot of variability in the humans. And here's just one quote. Therefore, it is believed that the last common ancestor between the African apes and hominids lived during the Pliocene period. Unfortunately, this common ancestor has not yet been found. And that was from a biology textbook. This was actually a paper that was published in the Royal Society Journal. I love the title, From Australopithecus to Homo, the transition that wasn't. Although the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is usually thought of as a momentous transformation, the fossil record bearing on the origin and earliest evolution of Homo is virtually undocumented. And this is from evolutionists or conventional anthropologists, not creationists. So what about all these traits that make, what about all the Neanderthals and the so-called primitive traits with archaic humans? Well, they've actually sequenced the Neanderthal multiple Neanderthal genomes, and then we see news articles like this all the time. Humans bred with this mysterious species more than once. Your Neanderthal DNA might actually be doing you some good, and I'll tell you what that is all about in my other talk. Ancient humans may have been mothers to some Neanderthals earlier than we thought. So amazing, huh? Humans breeding with humans. So Neanderthals and Homo erectus. So Neanderthals had larger skulls than modern humans. And Homo erectus skulls were archaic humans as well, which is now what evolutionists are calling them, archaic humans, as well as Neanderthals. They just had smaller skulls, but they had this sloping forehead and a pronounced brow ridge. Well, it turns out that these traits are still with us today. So this is, there's a guy in South Africa who's a dentist, and he takes pictures of his patients that have these so-called archaic traits. And I don't know if this guy knew what was going on, but he got his picture taken. So look at the brow ridge on this guy, absolutely huge. And here's some rugby players from Eastern Europe. I don't know what it is about rugby players, but I mean, I guess they're more primitive. Is that? Anyways, look at the brow ridges and the sloping foreheads on these guys. So it's interesting because most of the Neanderthal fossils are found in Eastern Europe as well, but You could literally go down to the local mall and sit there and look at people and see these things. Just don't be obvious about it. So here's a famous guy who's a professional boxer. He only lost one match his entire career, a Russian guy. Now he's a member of the Russian parliament. He's really smart. He actually revels in the fact that people consider him a Neanderthal. So he loves getting his picture taken, especially these side shots, you know. So look at this guy's forehead and brow ridge. So anyways, it's just human variation. It's not evolution. So here's two tennis players. One of them's actually lives in Dallas. They're both just retired. Anyways, the one guy's almost 7 feet tall. The other guy was 5'7". This match went to several tie breaks, so it was a really close match. But it's just variation, not evolution. So there's just a lot of variation in humans and, of course, other kinds of animals as well. And so this is all very important when it comes to a historical Adam, because we have genealogies for both sides. There's Christ's stepfather Joseph and his mother. And so genealogies and chronologies must be pretty important to God, because it underlies the gospel, which connects the first Adam who fell and plunged all of us into total depravity and brought a curse upon creation, and that's why we have evil and all this stuff going on in the world. And anyway, so it's very important. Adam is very important, but organizations like this, Biologos, would like you to believe that you evolved from an ape. And some of them believe that God selected an Adam from an ancient hominid population. Other ones believe that Adam never existed. But nevertheless, either theory is not biblical or scientific. And this is very important. I'm just going to wrap it up with a couple of scriptures why the Apostle Paul thought this was very important. Romans 5:12, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. And again, 1 Corinthians 15:22, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. Praise the Lord for that. So anyways, I've got a number of books. I've got a book on chimps and humans where I literally talk about the entire gamut of so-called human evolution. I talk about the human-chimp DNA similarities, pseudogenes, the chromosome 2 fusion, just almost everything you can think of relating to human evolution is in that and debunked, mind you. And I have another book on the design and complexity of the cell, which talks about the amazing design that God has built into cells. I have another book called The Fossils Still Say No. I will be doing a talk on this, so don't miss that. I'll be covering a lot of really important stuff in that. And then, of course, Creation Basics and Beyond is just a book that kind of touches on almost every topic pertinent to creation science. And we have a Discovery Center in Dallas, which is great. It doesn't matter if you've got young kids or you're just all a group of adults. There's something there for everyone. And it's a great place to visit and take even people that are not Christians or skeptics, take them there as well. And so I would highly recommend going there if you ever get down through Dallas. And we also have a magazine called Acts and Facts, which you can get this magazine. It's a beautiful, glossy magazine. You can get it delivered to your door free every 2 months. And we also have a kids edition that comes out in the fall as well. And or you can just get a PDF and just read it on your iPad or your tablet. Anyways, this is new. They asked me to put this in my talk, so maybe we could just leave that up there for a bit. So if you want to scan that QR code, you can be brought to a web page where you can actually sign up for Acts and Facts. And also we have Days of Praise, which is a daily devotional, which has many devotions in it from our founder, Henry Morris II, who was absolutely an incredible man who not only knew evolution and science quite well and how to debunk evolution, but he was also a great theologian as well. And he's got all kinds of really great devotions in there, which are still pertinent to this day, even though he passed away in 2006. So anyways, that's it. Sorry if I went a little long. But, yeah.